The cool autumn breeze rustled through the leaves as Staff Sergeant Mike Chen drove down the familiar streets of his hometown. After 15 long months deployed overseas, his heart raced with anticipation. He'd managed to come home 3 weeks earlier than planned, hoping to surprise his wife and their 7-year-old daughter. The street looked exactly as he remembered it, kids' bicycles scattered on front lawns, the old Thompson couple still tending to their prized roses, and the crooked mailbox at number 23 that nobody had bothered to fix. But as he pulled into his driveway, something felt off. The usually well-maintained front yard was overgrown, and their daughter's favorite pink tricycle wasn't in its usual spot by the garage. Mike's hands trembled slightly as he turned off the engine. The windows of their modest 2-story home were dark, despite it being early evening. No warm light spilled from the kitchen where his wife usually prepared dinner at this hour, no sound of cartoons from their daughter's favorite TV show. He grabbed his duffel bag from the passenger seat, his combat boots crunching on the gravel. The key felt heavy in his hand as he approached the front door. The familiar wreath his wife had hung before his deployment was gone, leaving behind a faded outline on the dark wood. The door creaked open, revealing an emptiness that hit him like a physical blow. The entryway, once filled with family photos and his daughter's artwork, was bare. His footsteps echoed through the vacant space where their comfortable living room furniture had once been. The walls, stripped of memories, stared back at him accusingly. Mike's mind raced. Had something happened to them? Why hadn't anyone told him? His unit had moved location several times during the deployment, making communication sporadic, but surely someone would have reached him if there had been an emergency. He walked through each room, his soldier's training keeping him methodical despite the panic rising in his chest. The kitchen cabinets stood open and empty. Upstairs, his daughter's room, once an explosion of pink and purple, was just 4 blank walls. Their master bedroom, where he'd spent countless nights video calling his family during his deployment, contained nothing but dust bunnies in the corners. As he stood in the hallway, trying to make sense of it all, a sound broke through his thoughts. At first, he wasn't sure if he'd imagined it, a faint whimper, almost like a cry. Mike froze, his years of military training kicking in as he listened intently. There it was again, definitely real this time. The sound seemed to be coming from the basement. In all the chaos of finding his house empty, he hadn't checked down there yet. His heart pounding, Mike moved toward the basement door. As he reached for the handle, another cry echoed from below, louder this time. The basement stairs creaked under his weight as he descended slowly, his phone's flashlight illuminating the way. The familiar musty smell of their unfinished basement filled his nostrils, but something else caught his attention, a sweet, floral scent he recognized immediately. It was his wife's favorite perfume. At the bottom of the stairs, Mike's flashlight beam caught something unusual. In the corner, partially hidden behind their old water heater, was a cardboard box he didn't recognize. As he approached, the crying sound grew clearer, and his breath caught in his throat when he noticed the box was moving slightly. With trembling hands, Mike reached for the box. Inside, nestled among what appeared to be old baby clothes, was a small tabby kitten, no more than a few weeks old. Around its neck was a pink ribbon with a note attached. As Mike picked up the frightened creature, his eyes fell on the familiar handwriting that had sent him countless love letters during his deployment. The note read, "Follow the paw prints, soldier. Your mission isn't over yet." It was then that Mike noticed something he'd missed in his initial shock, a trail of paper cat paw prints leading up the basement stairs, each one containing a single word that would begin to unravel the mystery of his empty house. His military training had taught him to expect the unexpected, but nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to discover. With the kitten cradled in one arm and his phone light in the other, Mike took his first step toward solving the puzzle that would change everything he thought he knew about coming home. Mike ascended the basement stairs, following the trail of paper paw prints, the tiny kitten purring softly against his chest. Each print contained a single word, forming a message he read aloud as he climbed, "Your family is waiting at the place where. The trail ended abruptly at the top of the stairs. Mike's military instincts kicked in as he scanned the area, looking for any other clues. The emptiness of the house felt different now, less threatening and more like the setting of an elaborate puzzle. His wife had always loved creating scavenger hunts for their daughters' birthdays. Could this be something similar? A glint of something metallic caught his eye from the kitchen counter. Moving closer, he found his wife's favorite tea tin, the one she'd brought back from their honeymoon in Japan. Inside was another note, along with a small USB drive. Remember our first date? The photos will guide you home. Mike pulled out his laptop from his duffel bag, his hands slightly shaking as he inserted the drive. A slideshow began to play, showing photos he hadn't seen in years. There they were, both looking impossibly young, sitting at that small coffee shop downtown where they'd first met. He'd been home on leave, still wearing his uniform, when he'd accidentally spilled his coffee all over her medical textbooks. Instead of getting angry, she'd laughed and said it was the most interesting way anyone had ever tried to get her attention. The next photo showed them at the same coffee shop a year later, on the day he'd proposed. He'd arranged for the barista to write, "Will you marry me?" on her latte, but the foam art had been so messy that she couldn't read it. He'd ended up blurting out the question right there, still clutching his own cup of coffee, the ring box nearly slipping from his sweaty fingers. As the photos continued to play, Mike noticed something peculiar. In each image, there was a small detail that seemed out of place, a specific coffee cup, a particular painting on the wall, items that he recognized from the daily grind, that same coffee shop where their story had begun. His wife was trying to tell him something. The kitten mewed softly, pawing at his uniform as if encouraging him to move. Mike gathered his things, making sure the small creature was securely cradled in his arm before heading out to his truck. The familiar drive downtown felt surreal in the growing dusk, the streets coming alive with early evening activity. The daily grind looked different than he remembered. The old brick facade had been painted a warm terracotta, and new awnings adorned the windows. But the weathered wooden sign still creaked in the breeze, and the same bell chimed above the door as he pushed it open. The rich aroma of freshly ground coffee beans enveloped him, bringing back a flood of memories. But instead of the usual bustle of customers, the cafe was completely empty. The chairs were stacked on tables as if the place had closed for the day, yet the lights were on, and he could hear music playing softly from the speakers. "Hello?" Mike called out, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. The kitten squirmed in his arms, its tiny nose twitching at the new scents. From behind the counter, a familiar figure emerged, old Mr. Wong, the owner who had witnessed their love story unfold over countless cups of coffee. His weathered face broke into a warm smile. "Welcome home, soldier," he said, reaching beneath the counter to retrieve an envelope. "Someone left this for you." The envelope contained a key and another note in his wife's handwriting. "You always said the best things in life happen by accident. Like spilled coffee and messy proposals. Like the day we got the news that would change everything. Remember where we were?" Mike's breath caught in his throat as the memory rushed back. They'd been walking through Heritage Park after a routine doctor's appointment when his wife had suddenly stopped by the old carousel. With tears in her eyes, she'd told him they were going to have a baby. It had been an accident. They'd planned to wait until he finished his next deployment, but standing there with the carousel music playing in the background, it had felt like the most perfect moment of their lives. The key in his hand looked familiar. It took him a moment to place it, but then he remembered. It was identical to the ones used to operate the carousel. His wife had worked at the park one summer during college, and she'd always talked about how magical it was to start up the ride first thing in the morning, before any visitors arrived. Night was falling as Mike drove to Heritage Park, the kitten now sleeping peacefully in the passenger seat. The park should have been closed at this hour, but as he pulled into the parking lot, he saw the carousel was lit up, its thousands of lights twinkling against the darkening sky. The vintage horses seemed to dance in the gentle glow, their painted eyes watching as he approached with the key in his hand. But it wasn't just the carousel that was illuminated. A path leading away from the ride was lined with hundreds of small lanterns, creating a trail of light that disappeared into the park's rose garden. And there, written in lantern light across the garden's entrance arch, were the words that made his heart skip a beat: "Welcome home, Daddy." Mike stood frozen, the sleeping kitten stirring in his arms, as the sound of familiar footsteps approached from the illuminated path. The mystery of his empty house was about to be solved, but somehow he knew that whatever waited for him in that rose garden would be worth every moment of confusion and uncertainty he'd experienced since coming home. The lantern-lit path seemed to glow brighter with each step Mike took toward the rose garden. The kitten had awakened and was watching the play of lights with curious eyes, its tiny paws kneading against his uniform. As he approached the garden's entrance, the sweet scent of roses mixed with another familiar fragrance, his wife's favorite vanilla sugar cookies, the ones she always baked when she had big news to share. The sound of giggling stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't just one laugh, but several, light, childish sounds that made his heart race. The path opened into the garden's central courtyard, and what he saw there made him grip the stone archway for support. The normally peaceful rose garden had been transformed. Twinkling lights were strung between the trellises, creating a ceiling of stars above the courtyard. Long tables covered in white cloths lined the edges, laden with food and decorated with photos, hundreds of them, documenting every month he'd been away. But it was what stood in the center of the courtyard that brought tears to his eyes. His wife stood there, more beautiful than he remembered, holding their daughter's hand. But next to them were two small children he didn't recognize, a boy and a girl, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, with familiar eyes that seemed to mirror his own. The twins were dressed in miniature military uniforms, complete with tiny combat boots. "Surprise!" they all shouted in unison, and Mike felt his knees go weak. His wife stepped forward, happy tears streaming down her face. "Remember that day in the park, when I told you about our daughter? Well, 3 months after you deployed, I found out we were having 2 more surprises. I wanted to tell you in person, but then communications went down in your region for weeks. By the time we could talk again, I wanted it to be special. I wanted you to meet them like this." Their 7-year-old daughter couldn't contain herself any longer. She broke free from her mother's hand and ran to him, throwing herself into his arms. "Daddy! Did you find the kitty? We picked her just for you. The shelter lady said she needed a home too, just like our new house." "New house?" Mike managed to ask, still trying to process everything as he hugged his daughter tight. His wife smiled, gesturing to the photo albums on the tables. "I documented everything for you. When we found out about the twins, we needed more space. I didn't want to make such a big decision without you, but then I found this perfect place just 2 streets over from our old house. It has a huge backyard, 4 bedrooms, and..." She paused, reaching for a set of keys in her pocket. "It needs someone special to make it a home." The twins, who had been shyly hanging back, finally found their courage. They ran forward together, their little boots making determined clicks on the stone path. "Daddy! Daddy! We know you from all the pictures," they called out in near-perfect unison. Mike knelt down, his daughter still clinging to his neck, as the twins reached him. The boy had his mother's gentle smile, while the girl had the same determined chin that Mike saw every time he looked in the mirror. They crashed into him with the unrestrained enthusiasm that only children can muster, and suddenly he was holding all 3 of his children for the first time. The kitten, seemingly understanding the significance of the moment, purred loudly and pawed at the twins, who squealed in delight. "Her name is Lucky," his daughter explained proudly. "Because Mommy said we're all lucky that you're finally home." As Mike held his children, he noticed more familiar faces emerging from behind the rose bushes: his parents, his wife's family, neighbors, and friends from his unit who had helped keep the secret. The garden was suddenly full of the people he loved most in the world, all of them wearing proud smiles and wiping away tears. His mother stepped forward, carrying a large scrapbook. "We've been working on this since the day we found out about the twins," she explained, opening it to reveal detailed chronicles of every milestone he'd missed. "First steps, first words, first everything, it's all here. We wanted you to feel like you hadn't missed a moment." The twins tugged at his uniform, eager to show him something. "Come see our special project, Daddy." They led him to a corner of the garden where a miniature military obstacle course had been set up, complete with tiny hurdles and a rope bridge. "We practiced every day so we could be strong like you." His wife joined them, slipping her hand into his. "They've known about you their whole lives," she whispered. "Every night, we look at your picture and say goodnight. They know all your stories, all your silly jokes. They even know about the time you spilled coffee all over my books." Mike looked around at the scene before him, his beautiful family, the love and effort that had gone into the surprise, the detailed documentation of every moment he'd missed, and the new adventures waiting for them in their new home. The empty house that had filled him with such dread just hours ago now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the fullness of this moment. The kitten had made herself comfortable on one of the tables, contentedly watching the family reunion while batting at a dangling ribbon. Mike realized that every step of this journey, from the moment he found her in the basement, had been leading him here, to a moment bigger and more beautiful than anything he could have imagined. His wife squeezed his hand, drawing his attention to the night sky above them. Through the canopy of twinkling lights, real stars were beginning to appear. "Welcome home," she said softly. "To all of us." The celebration in the rose garden continued well into the evening, with the children's laughter mixing with the soft music playing from hidden speakers. Mike found himself surrounded by story after story, each one filling in pieces of the life he'd missed while deployed. His mother-in-law had captured videos of the twins' first steps, taken exactly 3 minutes apart from each other. His father had taught them to fish in the creek behind the new house, documenting their first catches with proud photographs. As the night grew cooler, his wife suggested they show him their new home. The twins were beginning to yawn, though they fought against their tiredness with determined little frowns that made Mike's heart swell. His older daughter held his hand tightly, as if afraid he might disappear if she let go. "Ready to see your surprise?" his wife asked, her eyes twinkling with excitement. The family piled into their van, a new addition he hadn't known about, with Lucky the kitten curled up in a special carrier the kids had decorated with paw print stickers. The drive was short, just as his wife had said. They turned onto Maple Avenue, a street lined with giant old trees that created a natural canopy overhead. At the end of the block stood a 2-story colonial house painted a warm sage green, with white trim and a wraparound porch. Solar-powered lanterns lined the front walkway, and a tire swing hung from one of the massive oak trees in the front yard. "Home sweet home," his wife said softly, watching his face as they pulled into the driveway. The twins had finally lost their battle with sleep, their heads nodding gently in their car seats. Mike's daughter tugged at his sleeve. "Wait till you see inside, Daddy. I helped paint my room myself." Her excitement was contagious, and Mike found himself almost running to keep up with her as she pulled him toward the front door. The porch light illuminated a hand-painted welcome mat that read, "Our family's new adventure," surrounded by tiny handprints in different colors. His wife unlocked the door, and the smell of fresh paint and chocolate chip cookies wafted out to greet them. Inside, the house was everything their old home had been and more. The walls of the entryway were already covered with photos, not just the ones from before his deployment, but new ones chronicling the lives of the twins and their sister. A giant map on one wall had pins marking all the places he'd been stationed, with red strings connecting them to photos of what his family had been doing at the same time. "We wanted you to be part of every moment," his wife explained, gently touching one of the strings. "Even when you were far away, you were always connected to us." The living room was cozy, with oversized couches and a floor full of soft cushions where the twins had clearly spent many hours playing. A dedicated corner held a mini military setup, complete with a child-sized desk where the kids could write letters to their daddy. His daughter couldn't wait to show him more. "Come see the backyard. We have a vegetable garden, and I'm growing carrots. And wait till you see the treehouse." But first, they needed to get the twins to bed. Mike insisted on carrying them himself, one in each arm, marveling at how perfectly they fit against his shoulders. Their room was decorated in a theme that brought a lump to his throat. One half was painted with airplanes and parachutes, the other with medical symbols, representing both their parents' careers. As he laid them in their beds, the twins stirred slightly. "Story, Daddy," the little boy mumbled, his eyes still closed. Mike looked helplessly at his wife. He didn't know their bedtime routine yet. She smiled and handed him a worn book from the shelf. "This is their favorite. They said they wanted to wait for you to read the ending." The book was a handmade photo album, telling the story of a soldier who loved his family so much that his heart stretched across oceans to keep them connected. On the last page was a space for a final photograph, still empty, waiting for this exact moment. Mike sat between their beds and began to read, his voice soft in the dim room. His older daughter curled up in his lap, and his wife perched on the edge of one of the twin beds, her phone ready to capture this first bedtime story. Lucky the kitten had found her way upstairs and now sat in the doorway, watching the scene with contented eyes. She seemed to understand that she had played her part perfectly in bringing this family together. As Mike read the last words of the story, he realized that the empty house he'd found earlier that day hadn't represented loss at all. Instead, it had been a cocoon, waiting to transform into something more beautiful than he could have imagined. His family hadn't just grown in numbers, they had grown in love, in strength, and in their ability to turn challenges into adventures. His wife took the perfect photo for the album's final page, Mike surrounded by all three children, the twins sleeping peacefully while their big sister helped hold the book, and Lucky curled up at their feet. It captured everything they had become while he was away, and everything they would be now that he was home. "There's so much more to show you," his wife whispered as they quietly left the twins' room. "The home office we set up for you, the workshop in the garage, the garden." She paused, squeezing his hand. "But we have all the time in the world now. Tonight, let's just be together." They settled on the porch swing, their daughters snuggled between them, Lucky purring in their laps. The night was peaceful, filled with the gentle sounds of crickets and the distant whisper of leaves in the breeze. Mike looked at his wife and daughter, then back at the house where his twins slept soundly. "Thank you," he said softly, "for giving me so much to come home to." The next morning, Mike woke to the sound of quiet giggles and whispered conversations outside his bedroom door. The early morning light filtered through curtains he didn't recognize, and for a moment, he felt disoriented. Then the memories of the previous day flooded back, bringing a smile to his face. He wasn't in his barracks anymore, he was home. His wife stirred beside him, squeezing his hand. "They've been trying to be quiet for the past hour," she whispered. "The twins have been practicing their surprise breakfast routine for weeks." Right on cue, the door burst open, and three pajama-clad children tumbled in, with Lucky trotting behind them. The twins carried a tray together, their faces scrunched in concentration, while their older sister supervised, ready to catch anything that might spill. "We made breakfast, Daddy," they announced proudly, carefully setting the tray on the bed. The meal was a child's interpretation of a gourmet breakfast, slightly burnt toast decorated with smiley faces made of jam, fruit arranged in the shape of stars, and coffee that was mostly milk. Mike couldn't remember ever seeing a more perfect breakfast. "They insisted on learning to make coffee like the shop where you met Mommy," his daughter explained, beaming with pride at her role in teaching the twins. "We've been practicing with hot chocolate." As they all piled onto the big bed, sharing toast and stories, Mike noticed more details about his children that he hadn't had time to absorb the night before. The twins had developed their own secret language, communicating with quick glances and tiny gestures. His older daughter had their mother's graceful way of moving and his own determined chin. They were pieces of both of them, blended together in wonderful and unexpected ways. After breakfast, the twins were eager to show him their morning routine. They led him to their command center, a corner of the playroom where they kept their toy soldiers and a wall-sized calendar marked with important dates. Every day they'd been counting down to his return was crossed off with a different colored marker. "We did exercises every morning like real soldiers," the little boy demonstrated, dropping to do push-ups that were more wiggle than form. His sister joined in, their synchronized movements showing how often they'd practiced together. The day unfolded in a series of discoveries. In the garage, Mike found his old workbench had been carefully reassembled, with 3 small stools pulled up beside it. "They love building things," his wife explained. "They say they're making presents for when their daddy comes home. There's a whole box of their creations waiting for you." In the backyard, the vegetable garden was a mix of careful planning and childish enthusiasm. Neat rows of vegetables were interspersed with tiny flags and painted rocks. Each child had their own section, marked with handmade signs. The twins had planted sunflowers that now towered over their heads, creating a secret hideout beneath the massive blooms. The treehouse was a labor of love, built by his father-in-law with help from the entire family. Inside, the children had created a military observation post, complete with a telescope and hand-drawn maps of the neighborhood. The walls were covered with pictures of Mike and letters they'd written but hadn't sent, saving them for when he came home. "We played Daddy's Coming Home every day," his daughter explained as they sat in the treehouse. "We would take turns being the lookout. The twins were too little to remember you leaving, but they knew all about you from our stories." Lucky had made herself at home in the treehouse too, claiming a sunny spot near the window. The children had already built her a bed from old cushions, decorating it with ribbons that matched the one she'd worn when Mike found her. As the morning went on, neighbors stopped by to welcome him home properly. Each one had a story about how his family had grown and changed while he was away. The elderly couple next door had taught the twins to garden. The high school student down the street had helped his daughter with her math homework. The community hadn't just watched over his family, they'd become part of it. His wife had taken a leave of absence from her medical practice to spend these first few weeks together as a family. She'd planned activities that would help them bond, but also left plenty of time for the small, quiet moments that couldn't be planned. In the kitchen, preparing lunch together became an adventure. The twins insisted on showing him their cooking skills, carefully spreading peanut butter and jelly on bread while standing on their special step stools. His daughter had mastered the art of cutting sandwiches into shapes, stars for special occasions, she explained, and today was definitely special. "Watch this, Daddy," the twins called out repeatedly, showing him everything from their ability to count in Spanish to their mastery of cartwheel attempts that were more tumble than turn. Each demonstration was met with the kind of enthusiasm only a father who'd missed so much could truly feel. But it was the quiet moments that touched him the most deeply. The way the twins reached for his hands automatically when walking down the hallway. How his daughter leaned against him while reading her favorite book, as if she'd been saving the best stories to share with him. The sound of all 3 children breathing softly during an impromptu nap on the living room floor, surrounded by toys and half-finished art projects. In the afternoon, while the twins napped, his wife showed him the home office they'd created. The walls were lined with shadow boxes displaying his medals and commendations, alongside the children's artwork and academic achievements. A dual desk setup allowed space for both his work and for the kids to do their homework beside him. "We wanted to make sure you had a space that was both yours and theirs," she explained. "Somewhere to be both a soldier and a daddy." On the desk was a leather-bound journal. Inside, his wife had documented every day of his deployment, not just the big moments, but the small ones too. The first time the twins slept through the night. The day their daughter lost her first tooth. The funny things they said, the questions they asked about him, the ways they found to keep him close even when he was far away. "I never wanted you to feel like you missed anything," she said softly. "Even the ordinary days were extraordinary because they were part of our journey back to you." That evening, the family gathered in their backyard for a barbecue. Mike stood at the grill, a skill he'd nearly forgotten during his deployment, while the twins helped by announcing the color of each hot dog as it cooked. His daughter had appointed herself as his official assistant, carefully arranging buns on plates with the precision of a military operation. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across their new yard, and the air was filled with the sound of children's laughter mixing with the sizzle of food on the grill. Lucky had discovered the joy of chasing butterflies, providing endless entertainment for the kids who followed her adventures through the garden. "Daddy, tell us a story about when you were away," his daughter requested as they settled around the patio table. "But not a scary one, a happy one." Mike thought for a moment, then smiled. "Well, there was this little girl in a village where we were stationed. She reminded me so much of you." He went on to tell them about helping the village children build a playground from spare materials, carefully choosing details that would make his children understand the importance of his work without frightening them. The twins listened with wide eyes, holding their hot dogs forgotten in their hands. "Did they have swings like our tire swing?" the little boy asked. "We made them from old tires too," Mike answered, watching understanding dawn on their faces. "Every time I helped push those kids on the swings, I thought about coming home to push you on yours." His wife squeezed his hand under the table, understanding the deeper meaning behind his carefully chosen story. They had discussed how to talk to the children about his deployment, how to be honest while preserving their sense of security and pride in their father's service. After dinner, as the sky turned pink with sunset, they gathered blankets and pillows for what his wife explained was a family tradition they'd started during his deployment. "We call it star letters," she said, helping the children arrange their blanket fort in the yard. "Every night we could see the stars, we'd write letters to you in our heads and send them up to the sky, hoping they'd reach wherever you were." The twins demonstrated their letter-sending technique, whispering their messages with their eyes squeezed shut before pointing to the first visible stars. Their sister had a more sophisticated approach, using a toy telescope to aim her messages more accurately. "Sometimes," his daughter confided, "when I couldn't sleep, Mom would bring me out here and tell me that you could see the same stars we could see. It made you feel closer." As darkness fell, the family lay back on their blankets, pointing out constellations. Mike taught them the ones he'd learned during night watches, while they taught him the ones they'd invented themselves, the ice cream cone, the kitty cat, and the soccer ball among them. The twins, fighting sleep again, curled up on either side of him. "Daddy," the little girl asked through a yawn, "did you see our stars when you were far away?" "Every single night," Mike answered, his voice thick with emotion. "And I sent my love back to you through them too." His wife had brought out hot chocolate, their evening tradition, served in mismatched mugs the children had painted themselves. Mike's mug was new, decorated with tiny handprints and wobbly hearts, clearly saved for this special occasion. As the children slowly drifted off to sleep under the stars, Mike and his wife talked softly about the future. She told him about the twins' upcoming kindergarten registration, his daughter's soccer team tryouts, and the family vacation they'd been planning to the beach, their first one together as a family of 5. "I've been keeping a list," she said, pulling out her phone to show him a notes app filled with entries. "Every time something happened and I thought, I can't wait to tell Mike about this, I wrote it down. There are hundreds of little moments waiting for you." She scrolled through some entries. The twins' first sentences were both about you. They pointed to your picture and said, "Daddy Hero." They insisted on wearing their toy dog tags to picture day at preschool. Our daughter won the science fair with a project about military communications. She built a working Morse code system. Each small story was a thread connecting him to the time he'd missed, weaving him back into the fabric of their daily lives. The list went on: first words, favorite foods, funny sayings, small victories and silly mistakes, all the pieces that made up a family's history. Lucky had settled into the blanket fort, appointed herself guardian of the sleeping children. Her presence reminded Mike of how this day had begun, with confusion and emptiness in their old house. Now, just over 24 hours later, he couldn't imagine their family being any other way than it was in this moment. A cool breeze rustled the leaves of their oak tree, and Mike pulled the blanket higher over the twins. His daughter stirred slightly, mumbling, "Love you, Daddy," in her sleep. His wife leaned her head on his shoulder, and together they watched the stars wheel overhead, the same stars that had carried their love back and forth across oceans and continents. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "the twins want to show you their school. They've been practicing their My Hero presentations for months, waiting for you to be their special guest. And our daughter has a surprise piano recital planned. She learned your favorite song." Mike nodded, already looking forward to another day of discoveries. But for now, he was content to sit in the quiet darkness, surrounded by the gentle breathing of his children, feeling more at home than he ever had before. The next morning dawned bright and clear, filling their new home with golden light. Mike woke early, his internal clock still set to military time, and found himself drawn to the kitchen where he could hear quiet activity. There he found his wife preparing breakfast, just like she used to before his deployment, but with 3 extra lunch boxes lined up on the counter. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, wiping away happy tears. "It feels like a dream having you here in our morning routine." She handed him a cup of coffee, made exactly the way he liked it, a detail she'd never forgotten. One by one, the children appeared, drawn by the familiar sounds and smells of morning. The twins, still in their matching space-themed pajamas, were unusually quiet as they climbed onto their kitchen stools. His daughter entered last, already dressed in her school uniform, her hair neatly braided. "Are you really coming to school with us today, Daddy?" the little boy asked, his voice small and hopeful. "You won't disappear?" Mike's heart tightened at the question. He knelt down beside the twins' stools, looking them in the eyes. "I'm here to stay," he promised. "No more disappearing." His wife had prepared a special breakfast, heart-shaped pancakes, a tradition she'd started during his deployment to make difficult mornings easier. The twins had insisted on wearing their mini military uniforms again, proudly showing him how they could salute properly now. As they ate, his daughter pulled out a carefully folded piece of paper from her backpack. "I wrote this for you, Daddy," she said, sliding it across the table. It was a poem, written in her neat handwriting, titled, "My Hero Came Home." The family gathered around as Mike read it aloud, his voice growing thick with emotion as he reached the final lines. "Some heroes wear capes and fly through the sky, but my hero wears boots and sometimes has to say goodbye. Now he's back home where he belongs, making our family's love even more strong." Lucky watched from her new perch on the windowsill, sunlight making her fur glow golden. She had already claimed favorite spots throughout the house, but seemed to prefer being wherever the family gathered. After breakfast, they piled into the van for the drive to school. The twins could barely contain their excitement about introducing their father to their teachers and friends. Their preschool had planned a special Hero Day to welcome him, and other military parents had been invited to share their stories too. At the school, Mike watched with pride as the twins gave their presentation, showing pictures of him and explaining what it means to be a military family. Their classmates listened with wide-eyed attention, especially when the twins demonstrated their military training exercises, jumping jacks and marches they'd practiced every morning. His daughter's surprise came next. In the school auditorium, she took her place at the piano, her hands steady as she began to play. The melody was familiar, it was the lullaby Mike used to hum to her before his deployment. She had learned it by heart, adding her own special flourishes that made it even more beautiful. After the performances, the family gathered in the school garden for a special ceremony. The principal announced that they were planting a heritage tree, a young oak sapling that would grow alongside the children, symbolizing new beginnings and deep roots. Each member of the family took turns adding soil around the sapling's base. As they worked together, Mike noticed something remarkable. The confusion and anxiety that had gripped him when he first found their empty house had transformed into something beautiful, an understanding that home wasn't about a specific place or building, but about the love that bound them together. That afternoon, back at their new house, the family gathered in the living room for what his wife called the final surprise. She brought out a large scrapbook, its cover reading, "Our Journey Home." "We've been working on this since the day you left," she explained, opening it to reveal not just photographs, but ticket stubs, drawings, pressed flowers, and written memories from their time apart. "But the most important pages are the blank ones at the end, the ones we'll fill together." The twins climbed into his lap as they looked through the book, adding their own commentary to each page. His daughter leaned against his shoulder, occasionally pointing out details he might have missed. Lucky purred contentedly from her spot on the back of the couch, as if she too was enjoying the story. As evening approached, the family ordered pizza, a homecoming tradition they'd planned months in advance. They spread blankets on the living room floor for an indoor picnic, sharing stories and dreams for the future. The twins had already started planning weekend adventures, while their sister talked about teaching them all the songs she'd learned. Looking around at his family, his wife's gentle smile, his daughter's confident grace, the twins' boundless energy, and even Lucky's contented presence, Mike finally understood the full meaning of coming home. It wasn't about returning to a place you left, but about discovering the new place your love had built while you were gone. The empty house that had greeted him just days ago hadn't been an ending, but a beginning. His family hadn't just waited for him, they had grown, adapted, and created something even more beautiful than what he'd left behind. The mysterious cry that had led him to Lucky had been the first note in a symphony of revelations, each one showing him a new facet of love and family. As night fell, the children insisted on one more tradition, a group hug they called the family sandwich. As they squeezed together, laughing and slightly off balance, Mike felt the last pieces of his heart click into place. He was home, truly home, in a way that transcended physical spaces and temporal distances. His wife caught his eye over the children's heads and smiled, both of them thinking the same thing. This was just the beginning of their new adventure together. The empty house had been transformed into a home filled with love, laughter, and the promise of countless memories yet to be made. And somewhere in the night, a shooting star streaked across the sky, not carrying a wish or a prayer this time, but a thank you for bringing this family back together, stronger and more beautiful than ever before.